Let's learn about getting our animation controller set up. In my project right now, when I play it, I see there's a couple things happening. When I enter in, there's actually an animation occurring, which is just this stable. You can see there's a little bit of movement in there of this praying, and when I get close, it triggers this punch, which then goes right back into the praying. The praying will never change until I trigger the punch. So, how does that actually work? Well, let's head into my NPC controller under Animations. This is an animation controller, and in this window here, you can see a little bit of a overview. It's a nice visual system in Unity. And if I hold down Alt, I can click and move around in it. I see there's an exit state that I'm ignoring right now. It's not useful for what we're doing. We're going to keep our eye on the left-hand side here. I'll explain what we see. Entry triggers the first animation state. So it's going to point and connect to the first animation that will run, which in this case is praying. Now, how does praying work? Well, if I click on this little arrow, I'm actually going to delete it to show you what that is, that little triangle. If I right click on praying and go make transition, I can connect it to something else like this punch. Or I can connect it to itself by clicking back on praying. This serves as a loop. Praying, if I look over here, praying, once it ends, transitions back into praying once again. And this will keep on looping. So I see, oops, click back on here. I can preview this and see that praying just kind of stays stable continually until something tells it to do something otherwise. What is this otherwise? Well, this punch animation. But notice, I don't have an arrow pointing from praying to punch. There's no way for this controller to actually trigger the punch animation. I want to do that through my script when my player gets too close. However, I do have an arrow pointing from punch to praying. How did I make that? Right-clicking, make transition from punch to praying. I don't want to make two of them, but I have one here. If I click on this arrow, this line, I now see that there is this animation going from punch to praying. And how does this transition look? Well, if I press play, I see that Unity in this little band in the middle here is actually transitioning from punch to the praying animation at a rate that I predetermined. If I make this really small, what's going to happen is it's going to finish the punch and then bam, just snap right into the praying animation really quick. So a very minimal transition, or I can crank this way up and have it transition automatically much more slowly. It looks a lot smoother. And you can actually fine-tune the transition rate yourself, or even some of the details if you want to get really clever about it, but I'll let the automatic one, I think it's good enough for now. What this means is that every time punch is run, as soon as that animation is finishing, it's going to begin transitioning to praying, and that swing back to the original animation state will happen. So a quick summary. Praying loops on itself until punch is triggered, then punch will run once, and then transition back to praying. And that's kind of the way the animations work in this scene. How do I trigger punch? I'll show you that in the next video. For now, what I want us to do is to create a second animation state just to see that we understand this really clearly. So I'm going to right click and go create and find an animation controller. Click on that. I might just name this test animations and double click on it. Now I see that I have no states in here at all. I have an entry and an exit. I need to enter some information. You can always right click and create states and then actually in here find a motion in your project and connect the one that you want. So let me do the push here to start. And then I have to rename this. I'm going to rename this push with a capital. And another way I can drag an animation in, well, is by dragging. So let's do the boxing one. I'm going to drag this in over here. So notice the first animation I put in linked to the entry, which makes sense, but I have no connection between pushing and boxing right now. I'm going to keep this one simple. I'm going to have push, as soon as it's done, transition to boxing, and boxing, as soon as it's done, transition to push. So there's no looping of a single animation. It just transforms or transitions from one to the other. And if I click on this transition line from push to boxing, I see that it pushes, and then it's going to quickly transition over to boxing. Oh, I didn't show it quite nicely there in the transition. Oh, here's why. Yeah, we got to fix a little error here. This is something I'm glad to point out. The problem with our push animation and our boxing animation is that they're different types, so they're not going to behave well together. The animations that I provided you along with the assets here, I've already changed. Under their rig, if I click on the animation, their rig setting, it was initially set to generic. We want to make it humanoid, so it behaves like a character, like a humanoid character. The praying one is set, but my push one is still generic. They're different types of animation rigs. So I just need to change this to humanoid and press apply, and it's just going to re-import it. And now they have the same type. So now, when I go back here, this should actually transition nicely. Let's see if it behaves itself. There we go. It transitions out of it. Maybe I like that transition. Maybe it happens a little too quickly. I think that actually looks pretty decent. Let's look at our boxing to push one. So our boxer punches and then into the push. That one looks a little bit fast. I'm going to drag this out for that transition to be a little smoother. Into the push. That one looks a lot better. Okay, so I have my two states and I have them transitioning from one to the other. What do I do back in my project? Well, if I click on NPC, I have an animator attached to the NPC. I'll show you more about this in the next video. And there's a controller that it needs to be attached to. I have the NPC controller already there, but what if I attach my test animation controller? This is just a different animation set of behaviors. And now when I press play, we will see that it does the pushing and actually moves with it, and then the punch, and then the pushing, and then the punch, and it still behaves all the other ways nicely. And I fell off the map, of course. But there you go. It's following those animations in this different animator controller. And I can always just switch back to my NPC controller, and now it goes back to the other set of behaviors. So I have some quickly switchable and customizable active options for those animation states. And now you have the ability to build your own custom set of animations really easily using that nice, beautiful UI for creating the transitions. In the next video, I'm going to show you about a description about what I did in my script to actually trigger in my NPC controller this punch and revert back to praying successfully.